headphones as well.
Okay, so welcome Prima Vistat readers to this online event with Tariq Goddard and Carl Neville. I'm Berk Vaher, one of the main organizers of the festival, and we're talking about this book, Repeater Book of Heroism. And if you've followed news about this event, then actually that's the second leg of our talk. First, we had published in Estonian in the monthly paper Müürileht, and the English version is up on the festival website. So it's a kind of recap, partly what we talked there, but also I've kept a few questions specifically for this. We could still say live talk because it is live, even though this event was to take place in a real environment in Tartu Literature House with Tariq and Carl present. Hello, you both first.
Hello, Berk.
Hello, Berk. You're right.
Sorry to not be with you in person.
Yeah, you had a tough day at Heathrow without getting anywhere as the flight to Warsaw was cancelled, and being in constant communication with you two, I could sense your frustration growing. But there was a kind of twist at the end of the day to a tale when Tariq wrote later that evening, I quote, "The original plane actually had a mechanical fault, so who knows, we may have had a near escape."
Well, we're very stoical. So having edited a book on heroism, complaining about being stuck in an airport in Surrey wouldn't send off the right impression or vibe. It was miserable, but I would say it was more, our response was more to do with stoical endurance and that famed British sense of humour than panic or anything like that. And of course, getting on a broken plane is never a good idea. So yeah, I mean, rather than pissed off for being stuck in Heathrow all day, we're happy we're not dead.
Yeah, but for all the stress you had, there might have been an unsung hero or a group of heroes involved in taking that plane off the traffic.
Though the pilot tried and it didn't move. They kept us going for 2 hours, saying that it was refueling, before the woman at the desk's face dropped and went, "No, it's broken." So I'm not sure whether heroism is particularly applicable to yesterday, either on our part or that of Air Poland or Air Lot or whatever they were called. But we're certainly on the plane, though we're sorry not to see you, of course.
That was what got me thinking about how this situation can be interpreted in different ways, whether there was an interfering hero that diverted a potential catastrophe, or there was just a group of people doing their regular job and detecting that kind of technical error. Or alternately, you could say that there were a lot of people who didn't do their job properly, and that's why you couldn't come. So which way would you have it in the end?
Well, as I'm not that sort of romantic that projects their romanticism onto the world, but rather looks for signs of irrefutable romance emerging from life before I go for the sunnier of options, I would say a technical mechanical fault definitely lies in the third category.
Yeah, I'm going to go for the third. I'm going to go for the third category as well. Just that might be quite a British thing to do. So it might be less philosophical question, just a question of national disposition here, you know. So I think I'll think, oh, everybody just messed it up, and sort of by default these things didn't occur. So that will probably be I'll probably be in agreement with Tariq on that one, I would think.
Anyway, we avoided hysteria in our response, queued orderly. Received bad news after bad news on the chin. So I don't feel like we let ourselves down, though obviously, as I say, we're sorry not to be in a room with you and with a festival audience.
Yeah, it kind of gave me a cue where to start with this conversation, and how heroism is conventionally understood as an act of doing something and as committing something momentous, whereas alternatively,
yeah, I mean, I'd say not on the left, Berk, which was one of the reasons why we were inspired to put this collection together. The kind of heroism you're talking about, which is, if you like, common sense heroism, the heroism that most people think of when you talk about the concept, isn't the way the left like to look at it. The emphasis of equality and equality on the left, the way that talent should be equally distributed amongst everybody, as should outcomes, the way there are no extraordinary or fantastic people, but we're all heroes, mean that generally, given the collectivist ethos of people on the left or writing on the left, the type of heroism they prefer is the everyday humdrum kind. To use the example you were giving about yesterday's fuck up, the mechanic that notices the fault because they get up at 5 a.m. and check planes every day, rather than the pilot that lands the plane, it saves all the lives. So what we wanted to bring together was the importance of the kind of everyday heroism that doesn't in and of itself take very much courage to do, but to do it every day takes loads of courage, because that's your whole life, even though it's wildly unspectacular, with the conventional notion that we also agree and believe in, that sometimes an exceptional person does something that's really difficult that most people couldn't do. And they're both perfectly valid ways of looking at the subject.
What I was thinking by indicating this certain dichotomy between a hero as doing some kind of a super act versus a kind of everyday hero who's just doing his or her job, was that the similar kind of heroes have been emerging. And if you'd asked me for a contribution to the book, I would have written about Christopher Foyle in the TV series Foyle's War, because he's a kind of type, and I think he's a lefty, and he's a kind of example of an antidote to those highly eccentric, stupid detectives. He's just a good policeman doing his job in a situation where most people are either inept or corrupt or both, or just mediocre. And of course, there's a kind of duality, because you could also say that this doing your proper job and doing the right thing could create the ultimate anti-heroes, whereas Adolf Eichmann also just did his job, as is said. And
but I mean,
the actor
around corruption and ineptitude, then simply to remain true to a certain idea of your job unwaveringly is heroic. It may not produce acts of death-defying, thunder and lightning, startling heroism, but to daily pursue a series of standards that can alienate you in the context in which you're working is, I think, part of the kind of quiet, steady, constant heroism, the unremarked upon kind, that is consistent with the notion of the everyday hero. That to do it once isn't amazing, but to spend your entire life doing it, like looking after a disabled parent or 10 children with a very small household budget, to do it daily is a worthwhile and valid type of heroism. But that isn't the whole story with heroism.
Yeah, Carl, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to, predictably go off at a slight tangent here, which is when you said, ineptitude and corruption, and then I inevitably thought of Boris Johnson, and Johnson, is a hero of some of these populist leaders, Bolsonaro and various other people, are heroes precisely because they're inept and corrupt. And that's what gives them this heroic dignity in the eyes of other people who are also anti-establishment. And ineptitude and corruption, as opposed to being technocratic or decent, those are the now heroic qualities, a certain brash, unrepentant ineptitude and corruption. So I think, those people are heroes, certainly to many. So I think, obviously the heroes on the right, but I think it is interesting that probably sort of post, let's say, Berlusconi. I mean, I don't want to try and trace a whole genealogy of these things, but probably sort of post Berlusconi through to Trump and Johnson, Bolsonaro, Orban, and all of these other people. You've had the emergence of somebody whose heroism has, almost entirely resided in the inability to get things done. Their inability to follow rules. In fact, the desire to trash rules almost completely. The flagrancy of the corruption, the unashamedness. So, in other words, unashamedness has become, the sort of heroic quality as such now. So I think that that's it may not be a completely new category of the heroic or anything like that, but it's certainly one that predominates at the moment. And that trashing of sort of rules and regulations is also something that you would historically associate with the left, So go ahead, mate.
Don't you think that's anti-heroes inverting it and then posing as heroes, that they take unbelievable self-regarding, egotistical selfishness and have people go, God, we wish we had the courage to show that we're exactly like that too. Look at them getting away with it as well. And that there's this inversion. They're really anti-heroes. They're the bad guys pretending to be the good guys.
They are, in some respects, I think, but I think that they also sort of represent, the apotheosis in certain ways of a certain type of sort of neoliberal conceit, which is the assumption that we're basically all venal, we're basically all corrupt, we only go along with the rules to the extent to which we have to because of coercion and fear and so on. None of us are like innately moral or innately tied in or connected to these sort of, civic sort of duties or what have you. None of us are really like that. We're all just utility maximizing agents,
That's
so
a
it
way
really
of the world.
that.
Yeah. That's a way of the world that you have to put up with us because it won't get any better. That kind of attitude.
Yeah, not even you have to put up with this, but you should lionize us in some ways because we represent a truth that you either can't acknowledge, or we represent the apotheosis of a particular way of being, which is inevitable, unavoidable, and we don't have any of your sort of weak-willed evasiveness around this. We're not kidding ourselves that we're better than we are, like you are, and that's the sort of Promethean appeal we've broken away on the right, on the populist right. We've broken off the shackles or whatever. So I do think we have sort of, that's quite a digressive answer, I apologize, it just occurred to me. But I think we do have that sort of characteristics you would normally associate with the left in some ways. Now, are part of course, the province of this populist right as well. So there's a definite borrowing in some ways of that aura or that allure.
Yeah, it kind of tallies with a recent situation where two Estonian European Parliament MPs, the right-wingers, by the way, got into a late night, a rather early morning club brawl. And there seems to have been some kind of a racial slur involved. And surprisingly, many people justified them by saying that, well, it just shows they're humans too. I mean, middle-aged men do get into those situations. That was a kind of surprising thing.
That's the opposite of the heroic, though, isn't it? It's saying, well, we're all like that, really.
Yeah, but you're demonstrating the courage to be like that.
Yeah, they're human. Yeah. They're just like us. They're not these moralizing, stuck up their own arse automatons. They bleed, they fart, they swear, they fight, they like naked women. They're the good, we're the same. It's not really going for an example or a heroic example. Although I do take what I think might be Carl's latent point, which is that morality and heroism aren't necessarily interchangeable, which again, I think is part of the reason why the left, look upon some aspects, some parts of the left look upon the concept with some suspicion. I think for the want of a better phrase, quiet everyday heroism that we're talking about necessarily does involve a moral component. It can't not, because it involves a life commitment to do something all the time. So I think that kind of heroism is safe. But the heroism where you're doing something necessarily brave or dangerous or risk, often physically, sometimes morally and physically, on the spot, that kind of heroism doesn't necessarily need to be at the service of morality. You could be in, I don't know, the Wehrmacht, or the Khmer Rouge, and very bravely lay down covering fire for other completely evil people. And in doing so, do something that is undoubtedly heroic and beyond the means and abilities of most ordinary people. But you couldn't say that it was a moral or good thing. Mm-hmm. And yet there's nonetheless something redemptive about heroism. You are doing something that is good for someone. And just by virtue of doing something that most of us aren't able to do, are doing something extraordinary. But that need not always necessarily be something that informs a wider moral context.
Yeah, but that's something that I also thought about when considering those alternatives to the active hero, that there are heroic acts connected to non-doing or not doing certain thing. There's the story about Soviet time officer Stanislav Petrov, who allegedly resisted orders that could have started a nuclear war. Mm. And people around here now often ask, are there such Petrovs in Russia today? So that's a kind of example of heroism as not doing something. At the same time, calls for pacifism are now so highly loaded that they could even be thought of as sedentary.
I mean, I think we would. I mean, again, I suppose. I guess it isn't doing something. It isn't doing something, but I suppose what it is doing is essentially refusing orders, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it's not a sort of it's not the sort of the Chinese kids who are just like lying flat and expressing their protest through not moving or whatever. I mean, there's an overt refusal to carry out your role or to carry out your orders, you know, which of course would carry significant consequences. You would assume or whatever. So, but I mean. Yes, but I mean, I know what you're saying, because like, sort of in some senses, the heroism of refusal, the heroism of non-participation is most often overlooked because it doesn't have a spectacular component that is then sort of, you know, recorded into history or written in people's memories or whatever. So that, you know, there's a sort of secret, undisclosed undercurrent of heroism of refusal in the world, which is often unacknowledged, but and here's one of the instances that we know about, you know, the guy refused to push the button or whatever. But that's a whole different set of sort of subterranean heroisms that are very hard to get a purchase on and to talk about.
But I think, you know, if you refuse to fire on a group of unarmed demonstrators because you just don't want to kill people, although it's to do with restraint, I do think that it still feeds into a lot of the classic martial values, albeit not aggressively. Because the strength of character to not conform and to do something that you know is passed more or less under the radar. Mm-hmm. No one thinks you're the great one. They think the protesters are, you know. But you're doing that will lead to consequences for you privately and off stage for the rest of your career, if not your life. Mm-hmm. And you have to take that and calculate that in the very moment in which you'll go, no, I won't, you know? So I think that still feeds into the traditional notions of heroism we have, just in a less showy and eye-catching way.
Yeah, and in a way it's less easy to talk about because there are sort of fewer obvious examples of it around, you know. But I mean, no, I don't mean anything, but I agree. I think that's basically right.
Yes, that's why I was intrigued by this Matt Osman's piece, heroizing a loser, basically, a cartoon loser, but making a point of there being a certain heroism and trying and failing.
Well, to keep
trying all over again. Maybe doing something existentially pointless, but trying all the same.
You know, it's the Sisyphean Wildy Coyote in the Roadrunner films. Cartoons. If he tried just once, he would be a loser. But to always try in exactly the same way and never, ever, ever give up is heroic, even though you don't obtain the goods. And I think that's fairly consistent with the whole Sisyphean idea of you push the rock up and you know it's going to come tumbling down. But that's not the point. The point is what your face looks like as you're pushing the rock each time. It's to do with the taking part. And also, to do with being, and again, this is an English notion, a good sport. You know, you're not going to win. You're not going to get the goods. But you you take it on the chin and you have a go and you turn up, knowing that there's a first and second, and you'll always be second and last.
Yeah, and I think that essay's got sort of interesting things to say about time and how your perception of the heroic like shifts over time. You begin to realize that there are many sort of essentially quite futile Sisyphean elements to life, and coming to terms with those things, and then just supporting those structures day in day out in the face of time, withering various capacities and so on, is a sort of, again, it relates somewhat to Stoicism and is maybe therefore somewhat British. But I do think that that's got an interesting dimension, that essay on, the time factor, that he's grown to appreciate that character more as time's gone on, because he sees that the sort of, continued undertaking punishing and futile activities is basically baked into life, and you have to try and do it with a certain sort of elan.
Yeah,
I guess.
Once you've been around long enough, and you realise there's no such thing as victory, because even if you've got a #1 album, someone else will next week. It's not you anymore. And before
I was going to point this out, that he addresses a certain pop cultural counter ethos whereby to succeed is to fail. When you make it, you're a sellout. Somehow the glory of failure is coded into a lot of pop culture or counterculture.
I mean, I'd be admitting to be a failure if I just answered that question. What sort of insights do I have in failure and underachievement? Probably too many for comfort. I mean, there's two different points here. One of which is the wildy coyote attitude with humor. Humor is not a cop-out. It's a proper appreciation and wisdom of life. Is succeeding somehow a betrayal of the purity of your mission? That to succeed already shows you're the wrong person, because the only people that can succeed in a universe like this are sellouts, mediocrities, and violent, bad people. I would like to think not, because I don't revel in the fact that most of my heroes aren't head of states, but actually writers, actors, or pop stars. I mean, I would like, when everyone goes, oh, it's great, we're all so different, doesn't that make life interesting? I think no. I wish more people were like us. I don't think heroizing the cultishness and living in underground in our sort of little ghettos and communities is a desirable end in itself. I just feel like it's where we've been driven. So I'm for success, although I haven't had anything like as much of it as I want.
I would say, though, I think Berk is onto something sort of quite important that, is not only about pop culture, but it's also, possibly broadly more true of the left, which is, that notion that, well, not so much that if we were to take power anyway, we'd be defeated because the entire system's against us. But I think there is a lot of worrying about purity. It gets called purity politics, right, by critics. And I think there is a lot of worrying that, like, well, the path to power would require so many compromises that by the time we got there, we would have been essentially ruined by that process, ourselves morally, politically, or whatever. And it's nice to sort of, we can skirt on the edges of power, and that way we can maintain our ego and our integrity and so on. But if we to actually get there would require, being realists, would require so much of us that we would be transformed by it and become the people we despised or whatever. As that
is that the kind of lesson learned from New Labour, for example?
Well, no, but also it's
and Corbynism a bit.
Yeah, by any example apparent in history. But it's an aesthetic impulse, really, isn't it? We don't want to look like that. We don't want to feel like that. That isn't right. So, I'd rather make an album with really bad production. It's almost like taking that ethos and universalizing it into every other sphere of life, where remaining purer to a version of yourself and failing is better than having to, put it crudely, grow up and get your hands dirty.
Yeah, and I think that, like, my understanding, at least, of the introduction, to the book is that it's partly an argument against that sort of type of purity politics, really, and saying, well, of course, don't judge a person by their worst acts, judge them by their best. Well, depending what their balance of good to bad acts is, of course. But that you accept, as I would have done, like growing up, it would have been assumed, all your heroes have feet of clay or whatever. Ultimately, nobody's like perfect. It's fine, but on balance, they've done some good things, or they've shown this extraordinary tenacity, or what have you. And that would just sort of been understood. We got feet of clay, son. My dad would have said to me.
Attitude as well, if you're talking to somebody who'd been to prison, the whole conversation would be dominated by the act that got them into prison. In fact, that would be the last thing you were thinking about judging them by, the very worst thing they'd ever done in their life. So the idea that you can't admire, look up to, or that any of our leaders don't deserve to be leaders because at some point in their lives, or maybe some points, they did something personally or morally discreditable according to a criteria of perfection that doesn't and has never existed on planet Earth, is absurd. And we wanted to get some of that across, as Carl says in the introduction.
I'm going off at a slight tangent again here, and it's a bit related to sort of very specific aspects of British culture, actually. But there was, Tariq mentioned prisoners there. There was a point when there were a couple of very notable sort of TV pundits and intellectuals who were ex-prisoners. So John McVicar, they made a film about, Roger Daltrey from The Who, and another guy, I think. I can't remember. I can't remember his first name. His surname certainly was Boyle. Can you remember who I'm talking about? I keep thinking like Peter Boyle. It's not Peter Boyle. Danny Boyle's definitely not Danny Boyle. I can't remember. Not Frankie Boyle, but he was a Glaswegian. I can't remember. But he was also, he was rehabilitated in prison. He went on to become a lecturer in fine art or something. I think wrote several biographies. He was an extraordinarily violent criminal. But the notion was that he'd reformed. He'd got past that now. He'd become an upstanding member of his community and an artist or whatever. So it wasn't quite a redemption narrative in that sort of classic Hollywood sense, but there was a sense that he came from a tough background. He'd done some extraordinarily unpleasant things, and he'd found a type of redemption through art and had become an engaged, an engaged leftist actually. So, but I don't think that those kinds of journeys are sort of permissible anymore, actually. Not in the broadly consensual way it would have been accepted that movement was okay, say in the 70s or 80s. There's been a shift.
Someone's complaining about, can you listen to so-and-so because they've done this or that in their life?
There's the whole pop cultural valorization of hip-hop, where having been in prison is almost a must. And somehow it sits surprisingly conveniently beside that cancel culture, though it's really opposed to that, isn't it? It can be very sexist, very violent, and yet it's pop culturally valorized.
It is. I think we might wander into slightly contentious territory now, where we say that probably there's something like the narratives I'm talking about, which was working class guys who went to prison, learned in prison, then came out and had been transformed through an exposure to leftist politics or whatever. Possibly still now those kinds of stories would sort of be acceptable, no matter more or less whatever those people had done. But somebody from a middle class background, for instance, who had led an essentially blameless life, but had occasionally had once tweeted out something, contentious, using the wrong terminology, it could possibly be completely condemned for it. So it would depend where the locus of animus was really focused, and it would tend to be focused on people who are regarded as being enemies of identitarian strands of politics or whoever I would think. So I think it'll be very unfair, not unfairly, but it'll be very unevenly applied. Notice how cautious I was saying unfair, very unevenly applied, I think.
I think if a hip hop artist with a background in violent nihilistic rap tried to run as mayor of Atlanta or something like that, it'd be quite interesting to see what would happen. Would the left with both hands say this is a wonderful thing, transformative, or would they be going, well, on your 1992 album, track 3, there's some absolutely vile views about Korean shopkeepers or wherever, But I think the desire to attack in the end becomes this end in itself, to flagellate, to not, it isn't an impulse with a wider goal to succeed. It's more like an itch you have to keep scratching and bring as many people into as possible. I don't think it's a healthy political dynamic at all.
Yes, it seemed to be also those alternative currents of some kind of depravity being valorized in pop culture. Like, in a way, Mandarini writes about it in his piece Devils, that the ultimate hero is the ultimate bastard, let's say. And when it kind of switches back to canceling those kinds of people at first base and trying to bring on some kind of a more moral heroism.
I mean, I suppose that relates in some ways to a particular stage that we're going through now, which I alluded to a bit earlier, in which you have those populist leaders who, precisely through their or amorality, are the ones who are seen to be sort of an apotheosis of some kind, that stand up there on a pedestal or whatever, as being truly us in a way that we don't be or whatever. And I suppose the question again, my understanding of the sort of, at least the introduction to the book, is, how can we shift over essentially something into something like more positive, sort of not completely non-ethically compromised, but just sort of generally acceptable, obviously heroic figures, as a counterpoint in some ways to those devils or whatever, or those Père Jouissance or whoever, the father that licenses you with his own corruption or whatever. Who's a very seductive figure, of course. What can we pose against that figure?
So it's very productive about calculating. I can't like this song, or I can't believe in your political message because I know somewhere in your closet you did this, which means that is who you really are. Not that is part of who you really are, and to try and transcend that, you've gone to do something genuinely redemptive, like sing about it engagingly, or form a political position that can rescue you and us from that kind of behavior. It just goes one way. If that happened, you are this and that's that, full stop.
It ties into, I think it ties into, it's a very Western way of thinking, if I can say. That's a very broad observation, but I'll stick with it for the moment. Just because I think, there's an underlying assumption that if you have bad thoughts, then you must be a bad person. If particular thoughts, terminology, ideas, whatever, cross your mind, then those things must be coming up from the depths of your being, and at the depths of your being there must be something malodorous, right, and cantankerous and bad and evil. They don't think, well, your brain's just humming and busy with all kinds of socially constructed pieces of terminology and imagery and symbols and so on, and of course they all float around in there, and of course they adhere to the world in certain ways, and you're not ultimately really responsible for them. So there's a somewhat odd, I think, in the discourse, there's a somewhat sort of incommensurable sort of set of ideas about things. Either, well, your brain's just sort of a repository, a dump for discourse, and it all floats around in there and gets filtered out in certain ways, and also the thoughts you have adhere in very deep ways ontologically to you, that they're your being, the bad ones, not the good ones, the bad ones. So there's something I think that doesn't quite tally up in those notions, and something quite religious in them, and I feel that they tie into certain kinds of Western sorts of sensibilities in particular ways.
Also, even if you are bad, you could still have interesting thoughts and interesting things to say.
As you prove on a daily basis, Tariq.
This is just the biggest arts covering exercise in the world. Forget the war against moral absolutism. This is my excuse.
I started to think about this old Labour belief or actually also practice that if you school people's tastes, you somehow turn them into better people or better citizens. And I couldn't figure out, are you with Repeater and your authors in the same line of belief, or are you doing something fundamentally different?
What, are we involved in a project of social engineering?
That's one way of putting it.
Yeah.
Or let's say schooling tastes.
I don't. Well, I mean, in as much as we want people to enjoy the same things as we do, and that we're looking to try and create our own hegemony with all the things we like in it, yes. But are we didactically looking to lead people by the nose to live their life in coordinates with a certain limited criteria? No, I don't think. And also a broad church. I mean, there's lots of great authors in this. And one of the reasons why we commissioned this book is because we like our authors, we like the people we work with. And writing about your heroes is actually a way of writing about you. It's a form of autobiography. You're writing about what you really either want to be or what you admire others and would aspire to be towards. So it's a great way of knowing even more about, the people we publish and edit and work with. But I wouldn't say that we're looking towards either a cult of self-improvement or some kind of closed society. Carl,
do you want to add to that? Or?
Not particularly. I think like what we sort of collectively pine for. I mean, I shouldn't perhaps make observations about what everybody thinks, but I suspect that there's a certain longing for a point at which there was a sort of a shared and cohesive, not just a shared cohesive left culture, but something that Mark Fisher often talked about. A sense that everybody was tuned in at particular moments to certain national events, even if that event was only a weekly TV show. So Top of the Pops it would have been for us traditionally. So I think like what we're keen to have sort of, again, Tariq talks about hegemony, but, we're keen for very large, sort of broad-based communal, and I think real-time, actually, increasingly sort of events in which we're all engaged. So that doesn't mean that those things would necessarily be didactic. What they would be dialogic in lots of ways, in that we would all be interacting and creating new, sorts of ways of engaging with the world and so on through our sort of mutual group engagement with each other, or with a single sort of point or whatever. That's a rather it can speak towards a certain paternalism of we all sit around and discuss the great object, but I think we are possibly a little bit nostalgic for a time when culture was a bit simpler and possibly a little bit more paternalistic and possibly a little bit more didactic, because it gave everybody a central focus and brought us.
We say not all of our authors were alive or coming of age or having the formative years of their lives during those years, even though I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the centrality of something in culture where we all knew what we were talking about because we lived in real time and that was on TV last night, doesn't it generally exist now? And I think for many of our younger writers, never has, probably.
No, certainly not.
When we started Zero Books, which Carl was involved with from the beginning too, Mark Fisher very self-consciously said, wasn't it great that we knew next week so-and-so was going to release an album? We were all really excited about it because there would be sounds on it no one had ever heard before. This would be qualitatively original. You could, by 1989, you would have heard or known something you couldn't have known as a human subject in 1988. And without a context for all of that stuff, Zero and Repeater were a way of us trying to create that culture ourselves, but as Carl says, to some extent, recreate the culture, not nostalgically, but I hope in a productive and affirmative way, but recreate the culture that we absolutely took for granted growing up. But when I say we, I don't mean every repeater author, I just mean the really old people.
But that would be a good point to introduce your readings.
Sure.
Some of the bits from your entries to the book.
Carl, would you like to go first?
Why not? Okay, yeah. Well, just thinking about the context of writing it before I read it, I'll do that sort of fairly briefly. I wrote about somebody sort of close to me, so I wrote about my partner. And, you know, in a sense, she's not a world historical figure, you know. And I think, you know, there's quite a lot in the book where people are talking about people who are close to them, friends. Tariq's piece does that as well. But I thought in doing that, I would try and extend it out as well a little bit into thinking about possibly sort of slightly more sort of transcendent dimensions to this sort of, you know, this person's role, if you like. Okay, anyway, so I'll just go ahead and read it. Give me a second. Okay, so it's called Ayako, which is my partner's name. She's Japanese. I'm going to talk about my wife, Ayako. I'm going to talk about her as the mother of our daughter, Suki, and by extension, the heroism of motherhood itself. You can think of this as a love letter of a kind, or a public expression of gratitude, a public acknowledgement. First among the things I want to acknowledge is the sheer labour of giving birth and the level of existential risk that women, even in the developed nations, enter into in deciding to have a child. I don't believe there's any such equivalent risk, labour, or moment of existential uncertainty for men. I don't believe that outside the most intensive manual jobs or a role in the armed forces or the emergency services, any contemporary employment is as physically or psychologically demanding as childcare. I don't believe that any man will, outside of an accident, face the same degree of physical trauma or experience an equivalent level of pain. No man will have to undergo the anxiety of carrying the child itself or submit to the profound uncertainty of the moment when the contractions start, nor will they, immediately post-trauma, face the tremendous responsibility for having to care for and nurture the extraordinarily vulnerable form of life that is the newborn. The heroism I'm interested in paying tribute to is not only the quiet, continuous, unshowy daily devotion of motherhood and the enormous reserves of stamina and self-control that it requires, but also the demands of the birth itself and the long process of recovery, the coming to terms with the changes that the birth creates physically and psychologically. I want to acknowledge it because there are few more obvious instances of the combination of bravery and selflessness that defines heroism than that demonstrated by the mother, and because in culture more generally, it simply isn't acknowledged, except perhaps fleetingly or in unspoken ways. Perhaps without the enforced proximity of work from home, for many families, the scale of what's required by childcare might not have been revealed to many men, myself included. Getting out to the office to push a mouse around and deal with irritating clients and customers is light work in comparison. At one point during the second lockdown in early 2021, a neighbour with a child of 2 was out in the courtyard at the back of our flats. His daughter was home from daycare with suspected COVID and, in place of having her usual nap, was running around on the grass. Be nice if she had a little sleep, he said, and our conversation turned to a woman we both saw in the park daily who had a toddler plus twin newborns. A pause entered into the conversation as we contemplated just how she might be getting through lockdown with any wider support network she might have had access to closed off to her and a husband out at work. Then our thoughts roamed out to all the families dealing with children with physical or developmental problems, all the single mothers with limited means, all the women in the world with barely enough food for themselves, trying to feed and nurture a child, keep it from illness and danger, the enormous toil and toll of fighting not only for your own life, but for another's too. The figure of the hero is most generally male. In some senses, the mother is the opposite of the hero, the long, arduous hours of the birth and childcare, the mere preconditions for the self-assertion or the display of extraordinary capacities in the face of the wider world that the hero enacts. The hero stands out against the backdrop of mundane life. The aurora glitters with a certain Promethean fire, and nothing is more mundane in its unremittingness, in the drudgery it requires, or more quotidian than producing a child and being its primary caregiver. In some theories of the role of parents in relation to children, it's rejection of the mother that's the foundational act of self-formation. And so mothers must endure this too, to give everything in the knowledge that they are also that which must be rejected. Yet in some sense, all the questing and self-surpassing of the male hero, explorer, adventurer, soldier, freedom fighter, plumber of profound depths, or scaler of heights, founders finally on the monolith that is the mother. Many soldiers at the end, no matter how brave they've been, are known to cry out for their mothers. They seek, in their hapless floating into the night, the arms of those who guided and comforted them in the enormity of their entering the world, as they confront the parallel enormity of their leaving it. You might then say that the rejection of the mother and the motherly and the need for her are the unresolvable and incommensurable tensions that drive us, a perversely productive central aporia. The model of masculine heroism has, of course, shifted over time from the soldier and explorer to a different figure, that of the entrepreneur, the Atlas, according to some, on whose shoulders the entire world rests. The entrepreneur is valorized as a risk taker. It's possible to admire the tenacity and vision of the entrepreneur, however, without granting them godlike or more than human capacity. They may take risks, but they don't obviously put their lives on the line, only their capital, if it is theirs, a place in the hierarchy, the symbolic order, and we could fruitfully contrast the figure of the mother and that of the entrepreneur in asking the question of who supports and sustains the world, upon whose labor it really rests. That question, as to who really carries the world on their backs, is answered somewhat differently by the noted pediatrician and psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott. In a series of lectures on motherhood and the mother-child relationship, in which he coined the phrase, the good enough mother, and which later became part of a short book, Winnicott explicitly identifies the primal debt that the world owes to mothers. The care that they've provided in their ordinary devotion and their holding of the child, especially in the very early stages of infancy, are the preconditions for a self that is capable of existing more or less peacefully and flexibly in the world. They are the reason we live in a broadly tolerable and shared world, one not overrun with psychopathy and dysfunction. The world exists and endures because we've been mothered. In my own life, during the period when I was most lost and self-destructive, the care that my parents had offered me acted as a flaw on how much of myself I was prepared to throw away. There were reserves of their love and hope decanted within me that I felt I had no right to squander. We were too closely entangled in each other for me to damage them too, through the damage I was tempted to inflict on myself. Perhaps by saying motherhood, I simply mean we've been cared for, been shown love, our existence has been valued, and we've learned to value it in some way ourselves. Perhaps then I want to extend my tribute out past the mother I share a child with, and out to that mother whose child I am, who talks to me more freely these days, now I'm finally on the other side, in the shared realm of parenthood, about my own birth, how she was alone in the hospital, back in the days before fathers routinely attended births, had an epidural, and was barely conscious when I passed out into the world, and how the doctor who came in to stitch her up was drunk. Perhaps really I want to extend it out even further to all those who stand at the thresholds of life and work every day in its dim parentheses, in hospitals, care homes, hospices, and find ways when the symbols have broken down and disorganization reigns to mother us, who have found a way to guide us again through the terra incognita. Often those people are women. Perhaps I simply want to express gratitude to them, to the carers, all of whom fulfill in some way the role of the mother for us, and who we need deeply, no matter how far we think we might have risen from that need. Perhaps I just want to express gratitude to the women on the much derided Mumsnet, who calm the fears and anxieties of other mothers and fathers, my own included, with their own hard-earned experience, to the midwives who sustain and support other women through labour, day after day, and, at the other end of that journey, to the woman who met my sister and I at the doorway the night my father died, and whose words and demeanour soothed and calmed my terrible fear as, conjuring up my best facsimile of the heroic mode, I strode down into the underworld to see him, all his own heroism spent now, and to hold his hand for the last time.
Thank you.
Bloody hell, Carl.
Tariq?
Really good.
Thanks.
So I'm also going to do a my entries about someone known personally to me. He was family friend, and not just personally known to me, because he was a reasonably well-known playwright as well. But as my entries, it's a bit longer than Carl's, I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs and the last couple of paragraphs. Peter Barnes. My very early days were not particularly bookish. Books would come, but they would arrive later. My father drilled me in martial values and a form of stoical machismo that I still have a wary regard for. My mother with an earnest belief in God, which also still persists. And I credit them both for making me roughly as they intended me to be. Neither of them thought they were selling me abstractions. And although they both expressed some difficulty in understanding who I was, they did everything they could for me, given the people they were. And there's nothing I hold against them or myself regarding the outcome. It was our good friend and neighbour, Peter Barnes, however, my uncle Peter, who had the greatest influence in what I was to specifically do with my life. He offered me the noblest, most uncompromising, and deliberately unworldly advice imaginable, which at the time may have appeared slightly less bizarre than it does now, which nonetheless set me on my path as a writer. His example encouraged me to begin and then continue writing, which, despite the inevitable ebbs and flows in popularity, to say little of the hostility, warmth, and indifference with which my work has been received, helped me persist with my vocation, novel after novel, to a point where writing a book and finishing became the way I divided up my life. Moreover, he provided me with the ground zero punk rock attitude that has undoubtedly harmed my career, at the same time as ensuring that I have the self-respect necessary to write and create fiction and survive in an industry that does not always esteem its writers. I grew up in what I now recognise was a bohemian milieu, right in the centre of London, amongst people on their way up and way down. That we were allowed to live so close to the capital's landmarks at all, in light of the gentrification and economic cleansing that followed, seems in itself to have been a small historical miracle. Our neighbours were people who wanted to hide away from the judgments of society. Some were dissolute hedonists, others mixed race or gay couples cohabiting, the odd politician in exile, and scores of people who worked round the theatre. Actors, stagehands, carpenters, prop makers, chauffeurs, the lady that pulled the curtains at the National, and Peter Barnes, a successful playwright who nonetheless comported himself with genial grace and mocking self-deprecation. Indeed, years after he died, an acquaintance known to us both told me he'd always assumed that Peter lectured at some polytechnic or other, until he watched Alan Rickman read the address at his funeral and was persuaded otherwise. I'm going to cut straight to the last couple of paragraphs. But by then, I had learnt from Peter that everything is worth doing only for its own sake. There is no thanks, We are not part of a great plan. There is no justifying agenda. There is often little or no recognition for merit. And the only reward for staying the course is the respect of a few like-minded people, which is worth everything. This may be too harsh and desolate a philosophy for many, but as Peter had a religious belief in the value of his own writing and of writing in general, it was enough to inspire him to respond to the whistle every morning, writing in the British Library reading room, and after it was moved to King's Cross, in the McDonald's in Marble Arch. One of the greatest compliments he paid me was how much he enjoyed our chats, especially the long ones in the park or stood outside our doorways, where he would laugh raucously as we employed Henry James and Joseph Conrad to disentangle the secrets of the universe, and where he would defer to my literary judgments. At such times I knew I'd arrived and that these conversations were all the reward a writer's life required. Since then, I've come to realize that I owe much of my intellectual self-confidence to Peter. In time, this would mean I could work, edit, and publish writers cleverer and with more academic qualifications than myself, having ruled out any other accommodation with the culture industry and become a publisher. While I tend not to look up to people these days, any more than I would think of looking down on them, I grew up needing an example of who I could become before I knew who I was. And Peter would have laughed if I had picked Lee Marvin, who he considered a kindred spirit, instead of him, provided me with the rules, values, and framework I recognize every time I raise my voice or shake my head. And for that, he will always be my hero.
Lovely.
Thank you very much, both of you. So, one feature of this collection is those sometimes provocative juxtapositions between texts in really different modes, and I guess one of the most provocative is putting Carl's celebration of motherhood back to back with Ryan Donnelly's very different take of motherhood, or motherness perhaps. So Carl, how do you feel about it?
I think it's a good move, obviously, because you want a little bit of you want an internal dynamic and set of tensions and so on in the book. I mean, if you're asking me what I think about Ryan's take on it, that might be that is what you're asking me to say, rather than just the juxtaposition. Well, I mean, I'll immediately get into my sort of like defensive male mode here and say, well, who am I to gainsay a woman's experience of gender roles and so on and so forth? I mean, I'm clearly not going to say, no, she's got it all wrong. But I think like at least, I think we're effectively addressing it just from two different perspectives. Clearly, I'm not a mother myself. And clearly, in order to become a father, somebody needs to be prepared to be the mother of the child that I have. So, I mean, I'm only really expecting, so I'm expressing it to some extent from the outside, right? At one remove, or at two removes, possibly. I've got no idea, but some number of removes. Whereas Ryan will be approaching it from having been situated entirely differently in the world as a woman, situated differently within discourse and various other things. And also with a different set of relations to that process, because she's the one who has all of the bodily sort of enactment of that process. So I think, yeah, I mean, while they're oppositional, those two ideas, in that I valorize it and that she has certain forms of rejection of conventional notions of motherhood, and mine cleaves quite closely to them. I just feel that, like, well, it's okay, we can both have these sort of different ways of apprising it. Neither of us will really be right or wrong in it, because we're simply approaching the same set of circumstances from mutually comprehensible, but rather differently sort of situated arenas, if you like.
It's just a long way of saying there's room for us all, basically.
Yeah, there you go. If only that's why we need editors, Tariq.
In a way, it's if you look at the whole of the output of Repeater Books, you'll see that if you took all the books in their totality, they don't all agree with each other. We're not a political party with a specific program. And in the same way as that disparity of views, you know, I might edit one week a book that's saying this, and a couple of weeks later, I'm editing something else that contradicts the very same upshot of the book from a fortnight earlier. If you bundle, as we have all our authors, you know, between in a single book, you will find the same range of difference that you have in the entire catalogue compressed into that one space.
Well, but they don't agree with each other in political parties either. Even Chinese communists don't agree with each other.
The differences, yeah.
But Tariq, imagine Peter Barnes would have been a contributor to a book. Who would have been his hero?
Lee Marvin or Henry James. He definitely gave me gave me the courage to own up to what I liked. You know, that he was a massive fan of the director Robert Aldrich and those films he made with Lee Marvin, and he couldn't leave Henry James alone either. So he would have gone for one or the other of those. What he definitely wouldn't have chosen were any of his contemporaries, who he was often very rude about. His more successful contemporaries.
Of course.
Yeah. Undeservingly successful contemporaries.
Okay, so to wrap it up, who or what kind of heroes are the most conspicuously absent from this book for each of you?
Well, I'll jump in there first, Tariq, if that's all right, because I was thinking a little bit the other day. I was thinking a little bit about why isn't Corbyn in there, is what I was thinking. Given that Corbynism is, you know, has been the most significant sort of movement on the left as a way of coalescing various strands of the left, you know. He sort of didn't choose it really. It was almost entirely unexpected. Nobody's faced such a tremendous sort of barrage or onslaught from the establishment, from the right or whatever. Why have none of us, actually, I mean, I was quite heavily involved in this process from the start, more or less. Why have none of us chosen him? I don't necessarily know the answer to that, except I think nobody wants to be too closely associated with very recent defeats. I mean, you know, defeats take on luster, become burnished with time, and you want to attach yourself to some great defeat in the past. But when they're too recent, then, you know, the smell of failure is still too strong in everyone's nostrils. It's possibly why, which is not a great act of solidarity on any of our parts. So the fact that he's not in there, or he or McDonnell or whoever, are not in there, I think is a telling omission on our part collectively, actually. And
I don't agree.
Strong answer for it, but go ahead.
You know, I think he suffered, but he wasn't necessarily heroic. There's a difference.
Go on, expatiate. Tell me why you think. Why you think that?
I don't think, you know, I think he suffered unjustly, but I don't think his response to what was happening to him was heroic. I think he endured it, clearly on the edge of his nerves, and that was about that, which is commendable and still a great, you know, commendation of him in the circumstances. But I don't think that quite hit the scaly heights, starry heights of the heroic.
Do you think that that'll shift?
We're tangent now since we're wrapping up.
Oh, sorry, but do you think that'll shift, Tariq? Just out of interest, do you think that as time goes by, he'll be looked back on as being a sort of a more heroic figure?
I think it will depend a lot on what follows, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe you can only make the decision of someone's heroism unless they're throwing themselves on a grenade for their colleagues. Maybe you can only make it in terms of with a certain amount of posterity.
He just looked to me like he was putting up with things in pain. I don't, you know, as I say, I'm not sure whether that quite qualifies as heroic. It's not. It's certainly not. Certainly nothing to be dismissed, but I'm not sure if it's heroic. I mean, but one of the things that we said when we were approaching contributors, though, to be fair, is could you please avoid the saints and the obvious names that come up in this kind of collection? I mean, wherever there are collections like this, you would expect, if it was on the right, you know, Churchill, to come up, or if it was on in the center, you know, you have Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, of course, and, you know, on the left, maybe Che Guevara, I don't know. But be personal, you know, you use your literary sensibility, whether you're creative or not. I mean, whether you're a creative writer in fiction or whatever, but using your literary sensibility and express those people that you've met or that matter to you, that do, rather than those that you think are a worthy subject to bestow this title on. You know, come from the heart on this. And I think when people do that, you shed away a whole level of names that you might expect to see up there, like Gandhi or Corbyn maybe, and you get the ones that have touched people very closely, which isn't to say they're all people that the writers encountered in their personal lives. I mean, sometimes they are public figures, but they're not necessarily the public figures you might think.
So will there be a volume 2?
No, I don't.
Why?
On the road ahead. Don't step into the same river twice, Berk. Who would you? No, you already told us you'd choose the guy from Foyle's War.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I'll have to watch one of those to know who you're talking about, but I think I get the general idea.
But what I was going to say about that particular choice, I was intrigued how this actor, Michael Kitchen, who plays Foyle, as the ultimate decent guy doing the right thing, had created this evil twin of Foyle's in the Brian Pern mockumentary, as being the kind of ultimate cynical manager to this invented rock star Brian Pern. So I guess, but that's the same kind of thing with Twin Peaks, where you, especially the return, where you have this evil coup and the good coup.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there has to be this kind of perceptible dark side to some of the figures to really appear as heroic rather than just decent.
Yeah, maybe it's the repeated book of anti-heroes is the next one, Tariq. Then, if you don't know, twin volumes.
Does the world need any help on that score?
No, possibly not.
It's spoiled for choice. You know? We have the news for that.
Okay, thank you very much. I do hope we succeed in meeting in Estonia next time, possibly in Britain, but definitely you're also welcome back to Prima Vistat, and hope you'll have a more heroic adventure actually getting here the next time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Berk. I look forward to seeing you in the flesh at some point.
Bye-bye.
Time for a quick postscript before a silent magician shuts it down.
I had a few practical questions.